Hello, and welcome to A Holistic Approach to Education. My name is Dorothea Williams, and I'll be your host today. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Tom Anderson, who is an educator who was a classroom teacher, a school site administrator, a district office administrator, and an assistant superintendent in California schools. I want to talk with you, Dr. Anderson, today about some of our most fragile students in our system, our special ed students. And how does, in this world of distance learning, do their behavior plans or whatever behavioral supports we had for them prior to going out of school, do those still exist once we're in a distance learning environment?
Great question. I think that it's really important for folks to understand that even during distance learning, the supports provided by schools, as they're applicable to what's happening in the home, should still be somehow available. So when we're talking about behavioral supports, we're talking about those things that we do at school typically to support students, but school's been happening at home for quite a while now. And in some cases, we're talking about heading back soon, potentially. Other places, we've made the decision not to come back until a set period of time, whether that's January or the whole year or things like that. So in some regard, distance learning is going to continue for a while, maybe for a long time. It might be part of the new paradigm of education. So it's important that we start to make the transition from solely site-based, school-based services to what do those things look like when a student might be in a hybrid model, where they're only going to school 2 days a week and 2 days a week they're at home, or 3 days a week they're at home, or they make the choice to continue with remote learning, but they still have some of the same behavioral challenges and needs for support at home. So I tried to put together a really brief slideshow with some of the basics around behavior intervention. I will give it a shot here in terms of screen sharing. Okay. And if you see it and we're good to go, then we'll work off of that. And I think that that will help us kind of focus this conversation about what behavior supports are and what they look like during this time of distance learning. So let's see how this works. And do you see that?
Yes, we do.
I'm going to put it on present mode.
Okay.
And we'll see how that works. Okay, and I'm going to back up to the beginning. So we're talking about behavior support, and we're talking about behavior intervention plans, which is a further step along the way, but in the in this model of distance learning. And so when we talk about supporting student behavior, we're talking about school. So this is not just about naughty kids. This is not just about students that don't do what they're told the first time. I mean, not we've all, but many of us have children of our own, and we know that every kid can be naughty from time to time, and that's not what we're talking about. We're focused on making sure that we support behaviors so that students can access their education. That may sometimes mirror exactly the challenges they're having at home, but sometimes they're different. And so when we focus on what students need to be able to do at school behaviorally, it's really about learning the way that school works. And again, we'll talk about what that looks like at home and during distance learning, but these are some of the areas that students they grow into, sometimes developmentally, they just grow into these good habits and traits, but typically it's through some explicit direct instruction and practice, practice, practice. So when we talk about behaviors that we want to support in education, we're talking about attention. And again, developmentally, students' attention levels typically increase over time. And with experience at school or doing sports or dance or activities, they learn experientially, I need to attend longer, or I need to focus harder right now. And a lot of that stuff happens holistically, but for a lot of our students, it doesn't. It takes some explicit, direct, systematic instruction about what the expectations are. it's like and following directions. So these are the processes and procedures that students learn at school, and they need to learn to be successful at school. Some of them pick it up pretty naturally. Some of them don't. Some of them listen to the teacher and immediately understand what is necessary for this. Some of our students look at their friends, their classmates, and they copy and then they internalize what I'm supposed to do to hand this paper in or raise my hand and things like that. And some of our students, this is a deficit area for them, and they need that direct instruction and that repetition to internalize those behaviors. Johnny, you need to raise your hand before you speak, or you need to pass that paper forward when the clock hits 0, or whatever the procedure is. Before I move on to C and D on this list here, Ms. Williams, is there any questions about that, or anything you think that I need to explain a little bit more? We're really just talking about those behaviors that are necessary at school, right?
Yes, but we're also talking about how does that transition for at-home learning. Is that correct? So
Yes.
those same things around being able to focus, being able to pay attention, the parents can get support from the school in helping their students to be able to do that at home with learning again. Is that correct?
Exactly. Great point. It is not at all out of line for parents to seek support from the school, even during 100% remote learning. Their students
Okay.
are online typically, taking classes and courses, doing Zoom, working in things like Google Classroom and Schoology, and this is what school is right now, and it's at home. So if you have a child, your own child, that struggles with any of these things, with attending the class for long enough, with understanding the procedures that go along with distance learning, because they're all different, right? We
Yeah.
don't hand in a piece of paper at the end of the lesson. We submit it by clicking a button, or it's a living document in one of our platforms. So there really are some new directions, and most of our kids are more tech savvy than we are, so they pick it up pretty quickly. But there are definitely new activities and new processes that they need to learn and follow. And that leads to letter C on here, which is rigor and persistence.
Let's
So one of
go to that next point, Dr. Anderson. So if we're talking about, does that include screen time? When we talk about attention, for some of these students, won't it be challenging for them to be on the screen for extended periods of time? So can that time be modified so that students can be more successful?
Certainly. And that discussion is around what's reasonable and what are the expectations. And so when we're talking about our students and how much screen time is required for attendance or a grade or whatever that is, there's our baseline. They've got to be in this class for 45 minutes, and 30 of those minutes need to be synchronous learning or interactive learning. And then 15 minutes, and these are just examples, and 15 minutes needs to be independent work, or what we call asynchronous learning, or whatever that standard is. And so we do have students that struggle with that. And we have students that didn't struggle with that when they were at school, but they do struggle with it at home. So is it reasonable for a parent to have a discussion with school staff around how do we address this? Are there things I can do as a parent to support my child in learning those systems? Or is my child one that just doesn't work well in this environment, or doesn't work to the same exacting standards that have been set up in this environment? So can we modify some of these things? Can this student take a 5-minute break when they need to? Can they stop the video and stop the audio and go get a drink or walk around the room or do something because they need that? And those are discussions to have, obviously, with your child's teacher, and if necessary, with your child's principal. Because even through remote learning, every student is in a class, every student has a teacher, every student has a site administrator, and when we get to talk about special ed a little bit more, every student has a case manager. So I'm going to share a little bit more about the staff to talk to in a few minutes, but that's a great question, is can parents ask for accommodations that are pretty specific to distance learning. And certainly that's completely appropriate.
Thank you.
Sure, good question. And that leads to the rigor and persistence piece. It's different through distance learning. A lot of assignments the rigor is either during the instruction or after the instruction. And so we need to support students that struggle with that need that extra help. Every class has a range of skills and abilities and proficiencies. And it's typically, I think, easier for teachers to have those students in class and differentiate instruction and deal with that. But some of that has to happen remotely. And so that's one of those pieces of behavior for us to talk about is how do we get kids to persist reasonably while they're working remotely. The other piece, and this is both at home, but more so at school, is social skills. And it's important. Behavior includes social skills because that's part of learning and growing and becoming a productive member of society. And lots of those social skills are learned at school. And they're learned, again, through this holistic, what's my friend do? What's the right reaction to that? How do I act when this happens? But a lot of that is instructed in class by teachers, or maybe not in class, sometimes on the playground or lining up for the bus, but it is instructed by teachers, either formally or informally. So social skills is another huge piece of behavior support. And this is maybe where we broach the subject of special education. We have students that have a social skills deficit that is identified intensively enough for them to qualify for a 504 accommodation plan or potentially a special education plan called an individual education plan, an IEP. And that drops down to number 2 on here, which is intensive behavior support. So typically, when we talk about intensive behavior support, we have students that have been identified through various processes, a student study team or a referral from a staff member or a parent seeking support, and a multidisciplinary team gets together and determines next steps for students, whether that's a special ed referral or a support plan that is not a special ed support plan, but can still be done for students in general ed. And I talk about that more in the next slide. But when we start to talk about intensive behavior support, we're typically talking about our students with special needs or our at-risk students, and there needs to be something additional or special or different done for them. And that includes distance learning. There needs to be additional supports for distance learning.
Okay, I have another question. So if a student perhaps didn't have a behavior support plan, who was a special ed student, but now parents are realizing in distance learning that some behaviors are starting to show up and their student is struggling more. Do they call for a meeting? How do they get some support for these behaviors that they're now seeing that perhaps they didn't see in the past when the student was actually going to school daily?
Sure. So if a parent is noticing, and this is very common, and that's a great question, if a parent is noticing that the student is either developing behaviors or behaviors are more easily accessed at home than they were at school, and they're not positive behaviors, they're not productive behaviors for school, can they ask for help? Definitely, right?
Okay.
It's just like if the kid was at school and was behaving poorly or not doing the things that they needed to do and needed some support because school is at home right now. And so if they have behaviors that are impeding their learning or their access to school, to instruction, they should be immediately asking for support. And we've been doing this long enough now that hopefully parents are aware of what access points there are, whether that is an email to the teacher, a phone call, a text message, but start with the teacher. And I talk about that a little bit more as well, as who you talk to in these situations. But the first step is always the easiest, or not easiest, but the most accessible person, and that's your teacher. If you need more support after that, the teacher can talk to you about additional staff support, or you can always request to speak with your administrator. It may lead to a meeting. It may lead to a student study team meeting or support meeting. It may not. It may be one of those things that you can have a conversation, somebody, whether it's the principal or teacher, someone else can just give you some resources that help. It just depends on the level of need. But
Okay.
definitely those behaviors that are becoming prevalent at home during distance learning should still be addressed, at least with support from the school. And that might just be resources or advice or tips, or it might be more intensive.
Okay.
So when we talk about those kids that do need that more intensive, explicit, direct instruction and reinforcement around changing their behavior, we often are talking about students with IEPs, individual education plans, or they might be on a 504 accommodation plan because they qualify under the Americans with Disabilities Act to get some accommodations and some support. But even we're recognizing these days that we have students that don't necessarily qualify as having a learning disability, but they do need this extra support. So most schools and most school districts are trying to integrate social emotional learning into their everyday lessons, and they're trying to integrate behavior supports where we don't need to make a special ed referral. We can intervene earlier and help kids be more successful. But the foundation behind a behavior intervention plan, which is where we end up typically, or not typically, but often, is these three basic big ideas. Before I jump into those, let me talk about the term I just used, a behavior intervention plan. A behavior intervention plan is a plan that is developed by a team of adults and experts, teachers, experts, administrators. The parent is a key piece of this. And it's really when you take a close look at the behavior or behaviors that are impeding a student's learning, and you develop a plan to help him or her change those behaviors. It includes these big ideas. It includes identifying what the problem behavior is. So does the student avoid tasks that are too hard by putting her head down or his head down? Do they get up and walk around class? Do they simply defy requests that are made of them? Is the behavior simply they're not doing the work they're supposed to do? Or is the behavior that they're excited, they're talkative, they're not attending enough because they're being overly social? Is the behavior something around a stimulus that they receive? Do they like to see other students pay attention to them? Is it attention seeking? There's a lot of different problem behaviors. And so the first piece of that is identifying the actual behavior. And sometimes there's more than one, but typically we like to focus on the most disruptive behavior, or the one that takes them away from learning the most. And then the next step is, why is that happening? And that sometimes is easy to see. It's easy to see that the student is reading well below grade level, and every time you ask them to read out loud in class, they need to go to the restroom, or they poke the person next to them and get in trouble. They're avoiding their task. It's pretty easy to see. Other times it really isn't. Student doesn't have a deficit in math, but for some reason it seems like when we put a times tables page in front of them, they never finish it. And it often ends up on the floor, in the garbage, or in their book, or somewhere else. So sometimes it's difficult to readily identify why the behavior is happening. And that's why we have experts in education that we can go to. And your question earlier about who can parents ask for support from is where I was headed when I said, ask your teacher first.
Okay.
If the student is a special education student, ask your case manager, which is often their teacher. Ask your case manager first, and they will access the necessary people based on the level of intensity of behavior to help with it. We have specialists, we have experts in education that have spent years and years in school learning themselves and then practicing their craft, and their craft is identifying why students behave the way they do. There are scientific and systematic ways to go about determining why students do what they do. And oftentimes this, when we get to like that very intensive behavioral intervention need, this might be a functional behavior analysis, where a board certified behavior analyst or a school psychologist comes in. Oftentimes it's a mental health clinician, a social worker, someone that comes in and they've been trained to do this and they've been doing it. And their job is to observe the student, to take data, to take a look at that, and then come back and discuss it with the team and hypothesize why, based on this information, we think that this student's behaving this way. And then the third piece is, how do we change it? And that's also important, number one, to have those experts involved, but number two, to have the family involved, have the parents involved, because they know their student the best. The guardians of our students have more information about our kids, our students, than anybody else. And it's why they're a required and an integral part of these teams as we develop behavior plans. So the three big ideas around behavior plans are identifying the behavior, finding out why we believe that behavior exists, and then how do we change it? First, we've got to give them a replacement behavior. Don't poke somebody when you don't want to do your work. Raise your hand and ask for help. Or appropriately ask an identified student next to you to support you, to help with something. There are many replacement behaviors that are appropriate, and we have to find the right one for this child. Then we also have to find how to reinforce that.
Okay.
Sometimes that's a token economy in the class where they earn tickets or stickers or buttons or prizes or rewards. Sometimes it's a call home. That's the thing the kid loves the most, is when mom gets a positive call home. So it is, again, a team decision around how do we best reinforce this replacement behavior so that we can sustain lasting change and positive results for students. And so those are the three big ideas around behavior plans and behavior support. And behavior intervention plans used to be thought of as only a special ed thing, as only students with IEPs. Occasionally you would have one for a student with the 504 who didn't necessarily qualify for an IEP, but is identified as someone with some special needs. And now we are realizing that the science behind behavior intervention plans works when it's done properly. And so why not use that for students without having to identify them as special ed? So a school psychologist or a special ed teacher or someone with experience can often sit in on a student study team or a student support team and develop a behavior intervention plan to be integrated into the general ed setting, or now at home, right? And I'll talk about that real briefly, but at home, so that we don't have to wait for special education referrals and do those things. So I mentioned at home, right? So most of these plans are based on school, and they're based on reinforcers at school and behavior at school. Many behavior intervention plans are applicable in the home environment because they're about these behaviors that may or may not look the same at school or at home, or might be worse at home. So most behavior intervention plans can translate to the home. They may need to be modified a little bit or tweaked a little bit, and that can be done just by the parent at home, because they're the one trying to get the student to do their work and do it successfully. Or it could be a team discussion again around how do we adjust this plan so that it works at home. They no longer get reinforcement from getting the tickets in Mr. Johnson's classroom, which leads to the students on Friday. So what can I do at home? Can I model the same kind of student store at home? Or was there another reinforcer that also worked well at home, like time on the computer that's not school-based, like video games or things like that? So what are those other reinforcers that might be more appropriate at home? But you should take a look at your behavior intervention plan, even at home, if your child has one.
Okay. I think this is very helpful because sometimes you don't know. And what I learned today was that students who are having behavior issues and may need some support with their behavior do not have to be enrolled in special education. They don't have to have an IEP or a 504. But if this is an interruption in their ability to learn, the parent needs to reach out and get some support from the school. Thank
Exactly, exactly. And when I said reach out to your teacher, if the issues involved are such that the teacher would typically need some support as well at school, everyone that used to work for us at school still does. So we still have those behavior specialists, we still have school psychologists, we still have veteran special education teachers that can advise a general education teacher
you.
in terms of helping a parent with behavior at home. So start with your gen ed teacher, or if your students in special ed, your case manager. Work your way through. If you're not getting what you need, you can talk to the site administrator, but it's very appropriate, whether your student is in special education or not, to talk to your gen ed teacher. And if the two of you can't figure it out, or a couple of you can't figure it out together, to seek some more intensive support from one of those specialists, because they're still available, they still work for us, and teachers should know how to get a hold of the school psychologist or the behavior specialist or whoever the right person is.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like you have some takeaways for this discussion this morning.
Yeah, I think we just talked about the first two. Don't be afraid to ask for help. It's 100% appropriate if your student, your child, needs some support at home around these types of behaviors, which are necessary for school success. If they're not attending, or it's tougher because of the length of time they're spending in front of the screen, which many students are struggling with, if they're not following directions, and that wasn't a problem at school, but it is a problem with distance learning, if they struggle with the rigor or being persistent in the work that they're doing, or if they're having social skills, they don't have access to their friends like they used to, and they're having, they seem to be a little bit more depressed. They're a little bit isolated. When they do have family or friends over, they don't have the same kind of positive interaction. If those things exist, it is 100% appropriate to ask for help and start with your child's teacher and move on from there. And I think the other big takeaway is, although we are in a different paradigm of learning now, and as we slowly transition back, hopefully in the near future, we're going to be in a little bit of a different system. The new normal is not going to be the old normal. And there will be students that maintain a remote and distance learning model for their education by parent choice, or sometimes by necessity. There will be those that have some kind of a hybrid or a blended model. And there'll be those that go back to school every day like they did before, and we still have some of these challenges with behavior. So the biggest thing is to maintain communication and consistency between home and school. And as much as you can mirror or be consistent and have continuity with the behavior supports your child is receiving at school and at home, we see a much higher degree of success when there is that continuity and consistency. And oftentimes the biggest piece of that is communication. So whether that's a regular Zoom meeting or phone call or email or text with your teacher, whether it's a daily behavior report, which a lot of our kids had when they were at school, maybe they need one at home. And maybe it's the opposite. Maybe the parent is checking in with the teacher each day to say how the kid did. And maybe the kid buys into that, which is, it's just the reverse of the teacher checking in with the parent. So there's a lot of different avenues to maintain a strong homeschool connection, but it takes work and it's difficult, especially in these days when we have parents that are working and coming home and working with their kids, and it makes for long days and sometimes frustration. And that's not just for parents, that's for students as well, and educators. So do the best you can to maintain a positive attitude, and that will be easier if you maintain strong communication with your child's teacher and staff at the school.
Dr. Anderson, I really appreciate this discussion. I think you've given us a lot to think about. Certainly the piece about being positive, but realizing that all of the staff members that were in schools prior to schools closing are still on staff. And so we have a lot of resources available through schools, and we need to have that line of communication opened so that parents aren't feeling isolated and that they don't have support. And just because your student is going to school at home does not mean that the school won't support their schooling even when they're at home. So that is good to know. I'm hearing a lot from kids and parents who are in um, working through this district distance learning piece, that the isolationism or feeling isolated and signs of depression are emerging. So it sounds like, based on what you've said, communicate with the school, keep that line of communication open so that we can get the support that students need.
Definitely. It is. I've heard the same thing that you have. I've heard from parents, from teachers, that students are struggling with the isolation, that many of them are showing signs of depression and anxiety and things like that, that they may or may not have had before. It might be intensified now. And although most parents have access through their personal insurance and things like that, or community agencies, which they should take advantage of, the schools are also a hub for mental health services. And those mental health services can be very informal, like just letting a kid talk to a counselor. As mentioned, we have school psychologists and we have social workers and marriage family therapists that do more intensive individual and small group counseling. And those things are still available, whether it's in person or over the computer, to varying degrees. And you just simply have to ask. And it's very appropriate for a parent to reach out. Again, you can start with the teacher and say, who do you guys have at school that can support my child's mental health needs? And if the teacher doesn't know, then go to the principal, and the principal will. And we do have that kind of support available, and it's more necessary than ever right now. And it's a definite need.
And I want to close with this question, and perhaps you can give us some insight. As students get ready at some point to transition back to school, will there be a transition plan? How will that work? Or do parents need to think about requesting that in advance? Because I know some students will have anxiety about going back. Some families are going to have anxiety. How does that whole piece work?
So most districts have either already or are revising a plan that they came up with. Many districts thought through the summer that we were going to start school in August or September. And so most districts came up with a plan for what that looked like, whether it was a hybrid 2-day a week or AM PM model. These plans exist everywhere, every district, and they're different, but there's a lot of similarity and consistency from district to district. And most of those plans rightfully included additional or more of a focus on what students' social emotional needs would be as they came back, and not just students, but staff as well, right? This is going to be a transition back for staff as well. So, like I mentioned, we have identified social emotional support providers in our schools, everyone from counselors to mental health clinicians to school psychologists, etc. And I know that most plans that I've seen have a specific detailed availability chart or whatever for these folks, because they know that we're going to need to make these people more available, especially when we first come back. Beyond that, there will be some work done with teachers before they come back in terms of how to identify a kid that is really struggling socially, emotionally, or to self-identify when the anxiety gets to you and you need a little bit of support and who to talk to. Most school districts have employee assistance programs, so that a lot of this is available by either school staff, or if you don't want to, because oftentimes people feel a stigma around mental health, if you don't want to share with your colleagues that you're having this kind of anxiety, there are other ways to go. There are other avenues for them. And like I said earlier, there's also always private insurance that typically handles some support for mental health. So I think the biggest thing, as you mentioned, is as we do start to come back, it's going to be key for people to really pay a little closer attention to the needs of students and staff around anxiety and stress and things like that. Although we're dealing with it now, it'll be a little bit of a different format when we come back. The stresses will be a little different and the anxiety might be around other things. But there are certainly resources available, and most districts have intensified or added supports in that area recently.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Anderson, for your tips on how to look at behavior plans and how to have them changed if necessary, have them put in place if necessary. I think this has been a very fruitful discussion, and we want to thank you for your time this morning. A to Z is our educational leaders who want to transform schools and to bridge the gap between educators and students and families. We look forward to you joining us again. And please feel free to contact us at a2z-consultants.com if you would like more information about today's segment or the work that we're doing with schools. Thank you again, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you.